Imagine being 10 years old and already working from sunrise to sunset. In the 18th century, play was a privilege, not a pastime. Tonight, let's wander back through time and see how children truly lived. If you enjoy peaceful glimpses into the past, press like, share this story, and subscribe for more calm history every week. Imagine waking up to the sound of church bells, not your phone alarm. The bells echo across a quiet town wrapped in the mist of another chilly morning in the 18th century. There's no hum of engines, no buzz of electricity, just the creak of old wooden carts and the soft clatter of hooves on cobblestones. That was the rhythm of life back then, slow, simple, and full of tiny sounds that told people what time it was. The streets smelled of bread and smoke, sometimes of horses, and always of life. Children would peek out from behind doorways, their bare feet cold against the stone floors, wondering what kind of day it might be. Back then, childhood wasn't something filled with toys and school holidays. It was, well, more of a warm-up act for adulthood. You didn't wait to grow up. You simply started helping as soon as your legs were steady enough to walk and your hands could carry a bucket. There were no light switches to flick, no cartoons before breakfast, no colorful cereal boxes promising fun. A child's morning began with the glow of a fire, if they were lucky, or a quick splash of icy water to wake them up if they weren't. For poor families, homes were tiny, 1 or 2 rooms shared by everyone. Wooden floors, smoky air, and the sound of a pot boiling over an open fire. If you wanted warmth, you had to make it. If you wanted light, you had to earn it with a candle that melted too fast. For rich families, mornings were gentler, the curtains drawn open by a servant, breakfast laid out neatly, and children wearing clothes that buttoned all the way up, whether they liked it or not. But even for them, there was no escaping the weight of rules and expectations. No matter where you were born, the world was ruled by grown-ups, and children had to find their own small joys within it. The 18th century was a world built on rhythm, the rhythm of the seasons, the tolling of the bell tower, and the tick of long wooden clocks that sounded louder in quiet rooms. When you're a child in such a world, everything feels enormous. The doors are taller, the rules stricter, the nights darker. But there was magic too, the kind that hides in candlelight and whispers through cracks in the window when the wind picks up. If you close your eyes for a moment, you can almost see it. The cobbled streets glisten after rain. A baker carries warm loaves wrapped in cloth. A blacksmith wipes soot from his face. A child chases a runaway hoop down an alley, laughing until their laughter echoes into silence. Everything feels handmade, the toys, the tools, the life itself. It was a time before machines filled the world with noise. Work was done by hand and heart, and time moved at the pace of a walking horse. The day stretched long, but it had a softness to it. People had to listen to the weather, to their neighbors, to their children crying in the night. If you were a child back then, your world was much smaller but somehow grander. To the farthest you might travel was the next village. Yet every corner of your street, every field, every creaky attic felt like its own universe. You might have thought ghosts lived in the churchyard, or fairies danced behind hedges at dusk. The imagination filled in what knowledge could not, and there wasn't much to distract you from it. No screens, no lights, no endless noise, just silence, stories, and stars. In towns, children often played between carts and laundry lines, darting around horses that didn't care much about where they stepped. In the countryside, they chased chickens, gathered sticks, or watched their parents bend over the earth, planting seeds. It was a world where even play looked like work. But it wasn't always sad, it was simply life. You helped your family not because you had to, but because everyone did. The word chores didn't exist, it was just part of being alive. And if you ever complained too much, you'd probably hear something like, "Don't worry, you'll get used to it," from your mother while she stirred the pot with one hand and shooed the chickens with the other. Children learned early that the world didn't bend around them, they bent to it. Yet, in their small moments of freedom, they found wonder everywhere, in puddles that reflected clouds, in the creak of floorboards that sounded like whispers, in the flicker of a single candle that made the shadows dance. Evenings were the calmest time. After a long day, families would sit close to the fire, their faces glowing orange and soft. Maybe someone would hum a tune or tell a story about something half true and half dreamed. For children, those moments were everything. They might sit quietly, heads against their mother's knee, watching the fire shift and spark. Outside, The air smelled of wood smoke and wet earth. Sometimes, the moonlight slipped through a small window and lit up the corner where the family cat was curled up. It was in those quiet hours that childhood felt magical, fleeting, gentle, and safe. Tomorrow, they'd wake up and work again, or study, or fetch water. But for now, the night wrapped them up like a blanket. If you could step back into that world, you might notice how slowly everything moved. No rush, no schedules packed with appointments. Just a flow of time marked by meals, chores, church bells, and seasons. And the children, they didn't dream of growing up to be YouTubers or astronauts. They dreamed of having a warm house, a good pair of shoes, and maybe, if they were lucky, a toy that didn't break after a week. Still, their laughter filled the air. It wasn't loud or careless, but it was real, the kind that rises from simple things. A tumble in the hay, a new puppy, a story told in secret. That was the world through small eyes, a world both harder and softer than ours, a world where childhood wasn't a pause before life. It was life, in all its tiny, trembling beauty. And as the night falls on our little 18th century town, the church bell rings again, slow and steady. One by one, candles are snuffed out. The streets grow dark. Somewhere, a mother hums her child to sleep. And if you listen carefully, through time itself, you might still hear it, the faint laughter of a child chasing a wooden hoop down a cobblestone street. Long ago, before the world got loud, the first sound most 18th century babies ever heard was not a hospital monitor or a nurse saying congratulations. It was the shaky voice of their mother, whispering a prayer, sometimes of joy, sometimes of fear. Because being born back then was never simple. It was a gamble between life and loss. Picture it, a small room lit by a single candle. The air smells faintly of wood smoke and linen. Outside, the winter wind presses against the shutters. Inside, a woman grips the hand of a midwife, the local one, who's been through this many times before and carries a cloth bag full of mysterious herbs. There are no sterile gloves, no beeping machines, just whispered encouragement, a few strong hands, and faith. And then, a cry, small, sharp, but full of life. The midwife smiles. Someone thanks God, a baby has entered the world. Now, what happens next depends entirely on where that baby was born. If you were the child of a wealthy family, your first blanket might have been embroidered with your initials before you could even open your eyes. There'd be soft fabric, silver spoons, and a servant bustling about to fetch warm water. You'd probably have a nursemaid, a woman whose entire job was to hold, feed, and soothe you, while your mother rested with tea and polite conversation. But if you were born into a poor family, things looked rather different. The room might have been crowded, siblings huddled in the corner, a grandmother whispering prayers. The bed was rough, the air cold, and the hope simple, that both mother and baby would survive the night. Babies were swaddled tightly, wrapped like little bundles so they wouldn't flail too much. People thought it helped them grow straight and strong. So imagine being a baby, arms and legs pinned, looking like a loaf of bread in cloth. Comfortable. Maybe not, but everyone did it. Fashion, after all, starts early. For poorer families, the first few days were quiet, practical affairs. No big celebrations, just getting back to work, with the baby tucked under an arm or laid beside the fire. Milk had to be fetched, bread baked, animals fed. Life didn't pause because a baby arrived. It simply made room for one more voice in the noise of survival. In wealthier homes, however, a new baby was cause for display. A christening feast, new gowns, sometimes even musicians if the family was particularly showy. Portrait painters loved rich babies, plump cheeks, lace collars, and an expression that said, "I already own more land than you ever will." Still, no matter your class, the 18th century didn't offer much security. Infant mortality was heartbreakingly high. Diseases, bad water, or a single cold could take a life before it really began. So parents, especially among the poor, learned a quiet kind of love, deep but cautious. You loved your children fiercely, but you didn't take tomorrow for granted. And yet, in those fragile first years, there was tenderness everywhere. Mothers sang lullabies while sewing. Fathers carved tiny toys out of wood scraps. Siblings fetched water for the baby's bath, or at least tried, spilling half along the way. Every gesture mattered because it was all anyone could give. Social class shaped childhood from the moment a baby took its first breath. For a peasant's child, the cradle might be a wooden box lined with rags. gently rocked by a foot while the mother spun wool or stirred a pot. For the gentry, a cradle might be carved from oak, decorated with ribbons, sitting near a window that caught the soft afternoon light. Even the sounds a baby heard were different. Poor children grew up to the tune of roosters, carts, and neighbors shouting across fields. Rich children heard clocks ticking, horses clopping on cobblestone courtyards, and soft piano melodies drifting from parlors. It wasn't that one life was better in every way, they simply grew in different worlds. Naming a child was serious business. Names carried stories, family honor, saints, or the promise of good fortune. Some families even reused names if a child passed away, a sad but common practice. It was a way to keep memories alive, to make sure a name had another chance at life. Religion was woven tightly into all of it. Baptisms came early, sometimes within days, not just for faith, but out of fear. No one wanted a soul left unblessed. The church bells would ring, and neighbors would gather, not for gifts or cake, but to witness the fragile beginning of another human life. The priest would sprinkle holy water. The baby might cry understandably, and the congregation would smile, relieved. For a moment, it felt like hope. As the baby grew, its place in the family was already decided. For boys, it might mean following their father's trade, plowing fields, or learning to read if the family could afford it. For girls, it often meant helping their mother, sewing, cooking, and preparing for marriage, sometimes before they even turned 15. Every child was born into a role, like being handed a script before you could speak. You didn't get to choose your story. You lived the one your birth had written. But even within those roles, there was laughter. Babies were babies, drooling, giggling, making funny noises that no century could change. The sight of a child learning to walk for the first time was as magical then as it is now. A tiny pair of hands reaching out, wobbly steps, a sudden fall, and everyone cheering like it was the grandest thing in the world. And oh, the things they used as toys. A carved wooden sheep, a rag doll, a shiny pebble. These were treasures. For poor families, a baby might chew on the corner of a bread crust instead of a fancy teething ring. For the rich, imported trinkets from France or small silver rattles would do the job. Either way, the result was the same drool everywhere. Clothing told the story of class, too. Babies wore long gowns regardless of gender, mostly white linen because it was easier to wash, or, let's be honest, bleach in the sun. Wealthy babies wore lace and ribbons. Poorer ones wore whatever cloth could be spared, but all looked equally adorable when they sneezed for the first time and scared themselves silly. Despite the struggles, families found joy in the smallest things. A baby's laugh could brighten even the darkest room. Mothers, exhausted but proud, found strength in those tiny smiles. Fathers, who spent long days bent over work, would come home and lift their child up, a moment of warmth that made everything worth it. Because even in a world ruled by survival and class and endless chores, the arrival of a new child meant the same thing it always has, a spark of hope. Maybe this one would live longer. Maybe this one would have an easier life. Maybe this one would change everything. As the candle burns low in that little 18th century room, the baby finally drifts to sleep, swaddled tight, dreaming tiny dreams. The mother closes her eyes too, tired but peaceful. Outside, the wind sighs, and a church bell rings in the distance. It's just another night in another century, but somewhere in that small bundle of life, the story of the future is already beginning to breathe. By the time a child in the 18th century could walk without toppling over, the world had already started calling them useful. Childhood wasn't a long, lazy stretch of playtime. It was more like a short hallway that opened straight into work. If you were poor, that hallway was very short indeed. And if you were rich, well, it was carpeted, scented with lavender, and someone else probably cleaned it for you. Let's start with the working class children, the tiny workers. Picture a village morning. The rooster hasn't even finished crowing, but there's already movement everywhere. Mothers knead dough, fathers patch tools, and small children shuffle out with sleepy eyes and bare feet. A little boy might be sent to fetch water from a well twice his height. A girl, maybe 6 years old, could be stirring a pot of porridge with arms that barely reached the handle. These children didn't get an allowance. They were the allowance. Every bucket carried, every errand run, every handful of weeds pulled from the garden helped the family survive another day. By the age of 5 or 6, many poor children already had small jobs, not chores, actual jobs. Some worked as field hands, scaring crows from the crops. Others helped in weaving sheds or taverns. There were street sellers who'd call out in tiny voices, hot pies, fresh apples, while weaving through the crowd with baskets that looked bigger than they were. And then, of course, the chimney sweeps. If you were small and skinny enough, that might be your fate, climbing up narrow, dark chimneys to brush out the soot. It was filthy, dangerous work, the kind of job no adult wanted, so naturally it was given to a child. Some were apprentices to chimney masters who took care of them, meaning they got food, lodging, and a whole lot of soot in return. It was miserable, but they found ways to cope. Some kids sang while they worked. Others made a game of counting how many chimneys they could climb in a day. Children have an odd way of finding laughter in even the grimmest corners of life. In the countryside, work was different but not easier. A farmer's child might walk miles to gather firewood or watch over sheep. Boys learned to plow long before they learned to write their names. Girls were expected to spin wool, fetch water, and mind younger siblings. The day started with the sun and ended with the moon. There were no weekends, no sleep in mornings, and certainly no "I don't feel like it today." If you were old enough to carry a basket, you were old enough to be busy. But life wasn't without moments of light. The countryside was open, green, and filled with small adventures. A child might pause while working to chase a butterfly or skip stones across a pond. Maybe they'd sneak a bite from a cooling pie when their mother wasn't tea-looking. The sort of tiny rebellion that has existed since the dawn of kitchens. Now, across town, life looked very different for the little lords and ladies. These were the children of merchants, aristocrats, or titled families, the ones born in big houses with servants who polished silver and scrubbed marble floors. Their childhoods came wrapped in lace and manners. A noble boy might wake up in a soft bed with heavy curtains, greeted by a valet who helped him dress. A noble girl might have her hair brushed by a governess while she practiced sitting still, because apparently, sitting gracefully was a whole lesson back then. Their days were filled with lessons: reading, writing, French, dancing, etiquette, and music. They were tutored in how to bow, how to hold a teacup, how to walk without slouching, and most importantly, how to appear smarter than everyone else. For upper-class parents, children were little adults in training. They weren't expected to be silly or loud. They were expected to behave like tiny versions of the people they'd one day become, which, in fairness, sounds rather exhausting. Still, it wasn't all stiff manners and piano practice. Wealthy children had their own secret joys, grand gardens to explore, dogs to play with, and endless corridors to race through when the adults weren't watching. There were big dinners where they had to sit quietly, but there were also lazy afternoons in the nursery, building little towers out of blocks or playing cards. Their toys were finer dolls with porcelain faces, miniature tea sets, toy soldiers, and rocking horses that looked almost real. And yet, even among the rich, the rules were heavy. Boys were told they'd inherit titles or land. Girls were told they'd marry well. Every smile, every step, every word was part of a lifelong performance. Childhood was more like rehearsal for adulthood than a season of freedom. Between these two worlds, the poor and the privileged, was a wide, invisible wall. Children might see each other in passing. A barefoot boy carrying firewood, watching a noble girl ride by in a carriage, both about the same age but living lives that could never touch. And here's the quiet truth: neither had it easy. One grew up too fast out of necessity, the other out of expectation. One dreamed of comfort, the other dreamed of freedom. And both, in their own way, had moments of joy that made their world feel complete. There were, of course, the in-betweeners, children of craftsmen, blacksmiths, or bakers. Their families weren't rich, but they had skills that earned steady respect. These kids learned trades from their parents, hammering, shaping, baking, or mending beside them. There's something sweet about the thought: a little boy handing nails to his father, or a girl kneading dough with her mother, their laughter mixing with the smell of warm bread. Work was tiring, but it connected families. In a world where every hand counted, even the smallest ones had value. Despite the hardships, children found ways to be children. They sang while scrubbing, giggled at silly jokes, and whispered secrets in corners. A flower found in the mud could make someone's whole afternoon. A bread crust shared between friends was a feast. And when the day finally ended, whether in a grand mansion or a creaky wooden cottage, they all closed their eyes to the same sounds: wind rustling outside, fires crackling, and the faint hum of a world still turning. Because when you strip away the lace and soot, the silver and sweat, children were children full of curiosity, laughter, and a quiet wish to be loved. Some wore patched clothes, others silk coats, but inside those small hearts there was the same spark, the same small voice wondering what tomorrow might bring. That's the thing about the past. No matter how far back you go, you'll always find the same mix of duty and dreaming, work and wonder. The world changes, but childhood never really does. It just wears different shoes. The morning didn't start with sunlight, it started with sound. A rooster crowing somewhere in the distance, the creak of a wooden door, the faint clang of a church bell announcing another day. For children in the 18th century, the bell was more than background noise. It was a reminder, time to get up, little one. The world won't wait. If you were a poor child, your day began early, sometimes before dawn. The fire had gone cold overnight, and someone had to coax it back to life. That someone was often the smallest in the room, crawling out from under a rough blanket, rubbing sleepy eyes, and shivering as they blew softly on the embers. The air smelled of smoke, hay, and something cooking that might or might not be edible. Breakfast wasn't a feast. It was simple, a bit of bread, maybe a bowl of porridge, and if fortune smiled, a piece of fruit saved from yesterday. You didn't waste time choosing you ate, because the chores were already waiting. Water had to be fetched, animals fed, floors swept, and younger siblings watched. In some homes, the children shared one wooden spoon and took turns eating the spoon, being more of a family member than a utensil. There wasn't much chatter in those early hours, just the sound of footsteps and the occasional sigh from a tired mother trying to do a dozen things at once. Yet somehow, between the clatter of pails and the rush of cold air through cracks in the wall, life felt steady. Not easy, but steady. If you lived in the countryside, mornings meant work. The kind that started before the sun burned the dew off the fields. Little boys might chase chickens out of the yard, and little girls might be sweeping the doorstep with a broom twice their size. You learned to move fast, because breakfast wasn't really the start of the day, it was just the warm-up. Soon after, everyone scattered to their tasks. Maybe you'd help your father in the barn, where the smell of hay and animals hit you like a wall. Or maybe you'd help your mother knead dough for the day's bread, your small hands disappearing into the soft, sticky dough as she tried not to laugh at your seriousness. There were no breaks, no "can I sleep a bit longer?" and definitely no snooze buttons. The cows didn't care if you were tired, and neither did the laundry. In towns, mornings looked a little different, but not by much. Streets woke slowly, with the sound of carts rolling, vendors shouting, and the smell of baking bread drifting out from shop doors. A child might run errands for the baker, or sweep the street outside a small tavern. If they were lucky enough to go to school, the morning rush meant scrubbing faces, straightening collars, and hoping their shoes, if they had any, didn't fall apart on the way. And if you think getting ready for school today is hard, imagine doing it with buttons that took 10 minutes each, and stockings that itched like crazy. For the wealthy, mornings were a calmer affair. Servants bustled quietly through long hallways, opening shutters and lighting fires in grand rooms. A young lord or lady might wake to the sound of soft footsteps instead of roosters. Their breakfast came on trays, eggs, bread, maybe even jam, though they were told to eat slowly, with perfect posture. Of course, the first task of their day wasn't feeding chickens. It was looking presentable, hair brushed, lace collars adjusted, shoes shined. The mirror became their rooster, reminding them to look awake, even if they weren't. Soon after came lessons. Tutors appeared like clockwork, ready to teach reading, writing, or the fine art of not fidgeting. But here's a secret, even the fancy ones got bored. They'd glance out the window at the stable boys laughing outside and wish they could trade all their Latin lessons for a single afternoon of freedom. Meanwhile, back in the cottages, the day rolled on. Once chores were done, some children joined their parents in work. The sound of spinning wheels, hammering, and animal bleats filled the air. For others, the school bell, a much less cheerful kind of bell, called them away. School was often one big room, filled with children of all ages. You'd sit on wooden benches, scratching letters on a slate. The teacher, armed with a cane that everyone feared but pretended not to, would pace slowly, making sure no one's mind drifted off to thoughts of lunch. There were no notebooks, no colorful chalks, just the smell of ink, wood, and determination. And when a lesson dragged too long, someone's stomach would growl loud enough to make the whole class giggle. Even then, laughter was whispered, because the teacher's eyes missed nothing. When noon came, it was a relief. Work paused, school let out, and for a few moments, everyone could breathe. Children ran home or sat under trees, munching on whatever they'd brought, usually bread, maybe cheese, maybe just hope. After that came the afternoon, which, for most children, meant more work. The line between morning and afternoon didn't mean much. The sun was the only clock. You kept going until it told you to stop. But even long days had small pockets of joy. A boy might find a shiny stone and tuck it into his pocket like treasure. A girl might hum a song her grandmother taught her while sweeping the floor. A group of children might sneak away to the fields, racing each other until their laughter startled the birds. There wasn't much time for play, but when it happened, it was pure, like a secret shared with the wind. By evening, the same bell that started the day might ring again, this time softer, slower. Smoke rose from chimneys and tired feet dragged home. Supper was simple, and candles were lit one by one, their flames flickering like tiny suns. Children ate, washed up with cold water, and huddled near the fire, eyelids drooping. Somewhere in the distance, you could still hear the last echo of the morning bell, fading into the night, a reminder that tomorrow would come just as early, and life would keep turning in its quiet, steady way. And that was a typical day. Not fast, not flashy, but full. Every moment had its purpose, every sound its meaning. The morning bell wasn't just a call to wake up. It was a heartbeat, steady, certain, and always there to remind even the smallest child, you belong here, you have work to do, the world needs your hands. And somehow, that thought, even on the coldest mornings, made it easier to rise. There's a certain smell that never leaves your memory, a mix of chalk dust, old wood, and damp wool. That was the smell of an 18th century schoolroom. It wasn't exactly a place that children skipped toward with joy in their hearts. It was more the kind of place they trudged to, carrying a small slateboard, a bit of bread for later, and the heavy knowledge that one wrong answer could mean sore knuckles by noon. Still, school was a strange and special world, one that shaped how young minds saw life. For most children, school wasn't a right, it was a luxury. If your family needed extra hands on the farm or in the workshop, books came second. Cows first, bread first, always survival first. But when parents did send their children to school, it was often a humble little room, one window, one fire that never seemed to warm the back row, and one teacher who was equal parts scholar, guardian, and mild tyrant. Desks were simple planks of wood. Benches creaked with every shift. The ink was made from soot and vinegar, which smelled as delightful as it sounds. Children wrote their letters carefully on slateboards with chalk, knowing that one slip of the hand could earn a sharp rap from the teacher's cane. That cane wasn't tea, just for show. It was the classroom-esque version of a reminder app. The lessons were repetitive but serious. Reading, writing, arithmetic, and above all, religion. You didn't just learn your alphabet, you learned your prayers. You didn't just read words, you read verses. And if you dared to yawn during scripture reading, well, you could expect the teacher's eyebrow to rise high enough to make you wish you'd never been born. Still, there was pride in learning. To write your own name for the first time, shaky letters, slightly crooked, that was a moment of triumph. For children whose lives were filled with chores, writing your name felt like claiming a piece of the world. It said, I exist, I can be known. Now, education wasn't the same for everyone. If you were a boy from a well-to-do family, your lessons were much more formal, often at home with a private tutor. You might start your day with Latin grammar, followed by arithmetic, geography, and, of course, handwriting so perfect it could slice through paper. There were rules for everything: how to stand, how to speak, how to bow, even how to breathe properly while reading poetry. A rich child's schoolroom was quiet, orderly, and filled with polished furniture. But don't be fooled, discipline was just as strict, and boredom could be just as deadly. Every now and then the young lord's eyes would wander toward the window where the stable boys played with hoops and sticks, and he'd sigh, wondering what it might feel like to run barefoot through the grass without anyone shouting posture. For girls, things followed a different path. In wealthy homes, their lessons were more about becoming a lady than about becoming clever. Reading, yes, but not too much. Writing, yes, but mostly for letters. Arithmetic, enough to manage a household budget someday. And, of course, Endless hours of sewing, embroidery, and perfecting that ever-important skill, sitting gracefully while doing nothing. The ideal was not brilliance, but gentleness. A well-brought-up girl was expected to smile softly, speak politely, and never, under any circumstances, climb a tree. Of course, not all girls agreed with that plan. Some snuck extra reading time by candlelight, whispering the words to themselves like spells. A few even borrowed their brother's Latin books, though they'd never admit it out loud. Curiosity, it seems, was stronger than etiquette. Back in village schools, things were rougher. If there was a teacher, they might not even be trained, perhaps a retired soldier, a priest, or someone who could read slightly better than everyone else. Rules were made up as the day went along. If a child misbehaved, punishments were creative. Some were made to stand in the corner wearing a dunce cap. Others had to hold heavy books until their arms trembled. And then there were the unlucky few who got the dreaded stick of learning, which, let's be honest, didn't teach much except how to duck next time. Still, laughter found its way into the room. When the teacher's back was turned, someone might sneak a crumb of bread from their pocket or draw a tiny face on their slate. And if you made your friend laugh silently, without getting caught, that was its own kind of victory. For children who never went to school, the world itself became the classroom. You learned by watching how your father worked the land, how your mother traded goods at the market, how your older siblings managed chores and people. You learned to listen to the tone of voices, the rhythm of footsteps, the difference between the sound of rain that meant stay inside and the one that meant go fetch water. Knowledge wasn't written in books. It was passed from hand to hand, word to word. And in many ways, that kind of learning stayed longer in the heart. By afternoon, when lessons ended, the classroom emptied with the same relief as birds leaving a cage. Children burst out into the sun, laughing, running, their bare feet slapping the dirt road. Freedom, at last. The teacher would sigh, close the worn Bible or ledger, and sit quietly by the fading fire. The chalk dust settled. The echoes of giggles lingered, and for a few moments, even the sternest teacher couldn't help but smile, because deep down, they knew those noisy, restless little ones were the heartbeat of the future. When evening came, the lessons didn't stop entirely. At home, parents quizzed children on verses or had them read aloud by candlelight. Some fell asleep mid-sentence, their heads heavy with dreams and new words. The candle flickered low, shadows danced on the walls, and the letters they had traced that day seemed to drift through their dreams, bright, ghostly shapes, spelling out a new world. So yes, school in the 18th century wasn't easy, or fair, or particularly fun, but it was powerful. It planted tiny seeds of curiosity in tired, hungry children, seeds that would one day grow into something bigger. And for those who were lucky enough to learn, those few precious words written with chalk on slate were a kind of magic. Not the wand-waving kind, but the world-changing kind. Because every story, every law, every dream that shaped the centuries to come, all began with a child, sitting quietly in a drafty room, whispering the alphabet to themselves by the dim light of a candle. If you were a child in the 18th century, work wasn't something you grew up to do, it was something you grew up with. The moment your legs were strong enough to stand, your hands were expected to help. And in a world where every loaf of bread, every bucket of water, and every coin counted, even the smallest hands mattered. It sounds harsh now, but back then, no one questioned it. Work wasn't a punishment. It was survival, stitched into the rhythm of every day like a heartbeat that never rested. Let's start with the ones who had it the hardest, the chimney sweeps. Tiny boys, some no older than 5 or 6, were sent crawling into narrow brick tunnels that twisted like black veins through the city's walls. The job, scrape the soot loose so the fire could breathe. The pay, barely enough for bread. The risk, well, let's just say the chimneys didn't always let go of those who entered. They climbed with brushes and scrapers, sometimes using their elbows and knees when their tools failed. The soot clung to their skin, their hair, even their lungs. When they came out coughing, blinking against daylight, they looked like ghosts made of smoke. And yet, many of them laughed anyway. They'd chase each other down alleys, leaving little black footprints on the cobblestones, pretending they were kings of the rooftops. Children, after all, have a way of finding play even in the ashes. Then there were the apprentices. To become an apprentice was like stepping halfway between childhood and adulthood. You left your family's home, sometimes forever, to live and work under a master craftsman. You learned a trade. blacksmithing, carpentry, tailoring, printing, or shoemaking. The days were long, the work tough, and the pay, if there was any, went straight back to your master. In return, you were fed, clothed, and taught a skill. Some masters were kind, almost fatherly. Others, well, they believed that a good apprentice was one who didn't talk, didn't question, and definitely didn't make mistakes. Still, there was pride in learning. To make your first straight nail, your first sturdy shoe, it was something you could point at your work and say, "I did that." And for a child with little else to call their own, that meant everything. Out in the countryside, children were the backbone of the farm. Before dawn, you might hear them yawning as they carried buckets of milk or gathered eggs still warm from the hens. They shoed geese, fetched water, and helped with planting and harvesting. By age 10, many could guide a plow as well as their fathers. There was no time to wonder about dream jobs. Work was simply what life was made of, from sunup to sundown. But there was a quiet beauty in it too. The smell of fresh hay, the sound of cows lowing in the fields, the feeling of running through tall grass after the last chore was done. And when the harvest was good, when the bread was plenty, those tired little bodies felt a pride bigger than any coin could buy. In towns, other children worked the streets. They sold matches, flowers, or pins to strangers. They carried messages, polished shoes, ran errands. Some were mudlarks, scavenging along riverbanks for scraps of coal or bits of metal. Others swept the doorsteps of shops or watched over horses for a few pennies a day. They were quick on their feet, clever with words, and always ready with a grin. Street children were survivors, not by choice, but by instinct. If a baker dropped a crust of bread, they'd appear out of nowhere, scooping it up with a cheerful, "Thank you, sir." They had no toys, no beds of their own, but plenty of stories. And in those stories, they were pirates, adventurers, kings, and queens, free in ways no master could imagine. Then there were the little servants, children who worked inside great houses. You might think that was a blessing, a roof, regular meals, clean clothes. But the truth was, it was its own kind of prison. They rose before everyone else and went to bed long after. They scrubbed floors until their hands cracked, polished brass until it shone like gold, and learned to move so quietly they might as well have been ghosts in the hallway, seen and not heard. That was their rule. But sometimes, when the masters were away, they whispered and giggled in corners, sharing bits of gossip or stealing crumbs of leftover pudding. Even in the grandest houses, childhood refused to stay silent. Everywhere you looked, children worked, spinning wool, tending fires, carrying water, hauling coal, helping mothers with endless chores. It was hard, yes, but it also made them strong, resourceful, and surprisingly proud. You see, there was a quiet dignity in knowing that your hands helped keep your family alive. A child might fall asleep exhausted, yes, but they also knew, I did something today. I mattered. And in a world where life could be short and harsh, that small sense of purpose was a treasure. Of course, not everyone saw it that way. Some adults, a few kind souls, began to question whether children should work so hard, or at all. By the late 18th century, whispers began about schooling and reform. Pamphlets were written, debates were held. But for most children, change came slowly, as slow as a winter sunrise. Still, it came. So when we look back now, it's easy to feel sad for them. Those tiny hands, those weary eyes. But maybe we should also feel awe, because somehow they carried not just the weight of their chores, but the weight of their families, their futures, and eventually, the world we live in now. They worked before they played. They grew up before they could dream. But every bucket carried, every field plowed, every soot-stained smile, it all built the foundation for the lives we take for granted today. And when the day ended, when the chimney sweep finally rested, or the farm girl sat by the fire with her feet sore and her hair full of straw, they didn't complain. They'd hum a tune, share a crust of bread, and let their eyelids grow heavy. Work would wait for them in the morning, but for that one quiet moment, before sleep took them, they were simply children again. After all that work, you might think 18th century children never had a moment to breathe, but even in the busiest villages and grandest estates, there was always a little room for play. Because no matter the century, no matter how tired or poor, children have always found a way to laugh. And sometimes, that laughter was the only thing that made the world feel human again. There were no video games, no blinking lights, no plastic toys with batteries that never seemed to fit. Everything children played with came from what they could find: wood, cloth, string, and imagination. A stick could become a sword, a pebble could be treasure, and a bit of old cloth could turn into a royal cloak, a baby blanket, or a pirate flag, depending on the story of the day. Let's start with the classics. Marbles were a favorite. Small glass or clay balls that clacked together with the kind of satisfaction only simple games can give. Children knelt in the dirt, drew circles with sticks, and bet their marbles with the confidence of seasoned gamblers. If you lost your favorite marble, it was tragic, but if you won someone else's, you'd tuck it into your pocket like gold. Then there were spinning tops carved from wood, wound with string, and set dancing on dusty floors. Children would cheer as their tops twirled longer than anyone else's, faces bright with pride. Sometimes the tops spun until they wobbled, fell, and rolled under the table, the 18th century version of a game over screen. Hoops were another hit. Large wooden circles rolled with sticks through streets and fields. You had to run beside them to keep them spinning, which meant children spent half their day chasing their toys and the other half chasing each other. And then there were dolls. Simple things, really. For the poor, they were made of scraps, rags tied together, faces drawn in ink, hair made from old yarn. For the rich, they were miniature masterpieces, porcelain faces, silk dresses, tiny shoes no bigger than a thumb. But rich or poor, a doll was a friend, a keeper of secrets, a quiet listener in a world that didn't often listen to children. Outdoors, the games came alive. Tag and hide-and-seek were as old as laughter itself. Children ran through fields, hid behind trees, and squealed with delight when found. Skipping ropes were made from twine or horsehair. Songs were sung with every jump, rhymes that made no sense to adults but perfect sense to small hearts. And ball games, well, those were universal. Leather-stuffed balls, sometimes just bundles of rags tied up tight, bounced between small hands with shouts and cheers. Even the poorest found joy in what little they had. A smooth stone might be carried in a pocket for weeks, becoming a lucky charm. A feather might become a quill for drawing in the dirt. A piece of bread dough might be molded into a pretend animal, then quietly eaten when no one was looking. Play wasn't about what you owned. It was about what you imagined. An imagination, that magical, invisible thing, belonged equally to everyone. Of course, not all games were for fun. Some were practice. A boy might pretend to plow fields or wield a sword because one day he'd be expected to. A girl might play house by rocking a wooden spoon like a baby, learning early the duties expected of her. Even play mirrored life, but within it, children found a way to soften the edges of reality. In wealthier homes, play was more structured. Children might gather in parlors with puzzles, card games, or even miniature billiard tables. They played the harpsichord, painted tiny landscapes, or learned polite games of wit to show off when guests arrived. But even they weren't immune to silliness. There are old letters that mention noble children sneaking out to roll hoops down corridors or playing tag among expensive furniture, followed, of course, by scolding servants trying not to laugh. The streets were their playgrounds too. You'd hear the sound of laughter echo between stone walls, little feet slapping against the ground, voices calling names. Your turn, not fair, do-over. Some things never change. Children raced wooden carts with wobbly wheels, fished in puddles after rain, or built small forts out of sticks in imagination. And when winter came, they sledded down snowy hills on anything that would slide, even the lids of barrels. At night, when the work was done and the candles were lit, the games grew quieter. A round of riddles, maybe, or a guessing game played by the fire. Older children told stories to the younger ones, tall tales of monsters, kings or fairies in the woods. You'd hear giggles muffled under blankets as parents pretended not to notice. Laughter, after all, was the only rule that never broke. And sometimes, when a child lay in bed staring at the wooden beams above, their mind kept playing even after their body stopped. They dreamed of grand adventures, of sailing ships, castles, or endless fields. Their world might have been small, but their imagination was endless. Because even in a time of hard work and short childhoods, joy found its way in through every laugh, every story, every simple game that turned the ordinary into magic. So when we picture the 18th century, the soot, the chores, the heavy days, it's easy to forget the sound that echoed through it all. Laughter, soft, fleeting, precious. It rang down alleyways, across meadows, and through drafty cottages. The world may have been ruled by adults, but for a few stolen moments each day, it belonged entirely to the children and their wild, unstoppable imaginations. If you could step quietly into an 18th century home just for a moment, you'd feel it right away. The warmth of a fire burning low, the faint smell of bread and smoke, the quiet hum of family life held together by habit, faith, and a fair bit of discipline. Children back then didn't belong just to their parents. They belonged to a way of life, to a rhythm built on respect, obedience, and prayer. It wasn't always gentle, but it was steady, and in its own way, it made the world feel safe. In most homes, family wasn't something you talked about much. It was just there. It was the sound of your mother humming as she mended clothes, or your father's boots by the door after a long day. It was the comfort of knowing where everyone fit and what was expected of you. Children were taught early that love didn't always come wrapped in hugs or soft words. Sometimes, love looked like work. It looked like a mother staying up to sew you a new shirt from old scraps. It looked like a father saving half his bread so you'd have more. And sometimes, it looked like being scolded because your parents wanted you to do better. It was a love built on survival, and survival didn't always leave room for softness. Faith sat at the center of family life like a quiet candle that never went out. Whether Catholic, Protestant, or another creed, religion shaped everything. How you spoke, what you ate, what you believed about the world and yourself. Before meals, heads bowed. Before bed, hands folded. Sunday was sacred, even if your only nice clothes were patched and too short at the sleeves. Children learned early that God saw everything. That thought was both comforting and terrifying. It meant you were never alone, but also never out of sight. Sundays were special days, a break from work, but not from rules. Families dressed in their best, sometimes borrowing from neighbors just to look presentable. The church bell would ring through the town like a call from heaven itself. Inside, the air was cool, heavy with candle smoke and old wood. Children sat still, fighting yawns, as the preacher spoke of sin, grace, and the long road to heaven. They knew better than to fidget. One sharp look from a parent was enough to freeze them mid. After service came the best part, outside, in the sunshine, where friends whispered and laughed quietly before their parents noticed. It was a short moment of freedom, but it felt like a holiday. At home, the rules were clear. Children were to be seen, not heard. You didn't interrupt adults. You didn't talk back. You listened, learned, and obeyed. That was the holy trinity of good behavior. And when you didn't, well, let's just say discipline in the 18th century was a lot less gentle than it is now. There were switches cut from branches, wooden spoons, leather straps, or simply a sharp word that could sting just as much. Parents believed they were shaping character, not cruelty, but correction. They saw obedience as love in action. Today, it sounds harsh. Back then, it was normal. It was what good parenting looked like in a world that demanded strength. Yet, not every home was strict. Some parents found gentler ways, a soft word, a story, a quiet talk after chores were done. Some fathers saved their best jokes for the dinner table. Some mothers made games out of the lessons they had to teach. And in those moments, laughter slipped in, lighting even the smallest cottages with warmth. Family meals were one of the few times everyone gathered together. A wooden table, mismatched bowls, maybe a candle if there was enough wax. The food was simple: bread, soup, sometimes meat. Children waited for their elders to take the first bite. Conversations were calm, usually led by the parents. Children mostly listened, nodding when spoken to, but beneath the quiet, there was connection, the kind that didn't need many words. And when the fire crackled just right, and everyone's bellies were full, even the sternest fathers softened. Maybe they'd tell an old story. Maybe they'd smile at something small, a child's sleepy yawn, a crooked grin. It didn't happen often, but when it did, it stayed in your heart. Faith didn't end at church. It lived in the daily rhythm of home. Prayers were whispered before bed, candles blown out with care. Children often slept to the sound of their parents' voices reading from a family Bible, or the distant toll of a bell marking another day gone. They grew up believing that life, with all its rules and punishments, was part of something bigger, something sacred. And though fear of sin loomed large, so did hope. Hope that if they worked hard, obeyed, and prayed, tomorrow might be kinder. In wealthier homes, faith and family took on a more formal shape. There were tutors to teach manners and scripture, servants to enforce silence, and portraits on the walls showing generations of serious faces. Children practiced curtsies, bowed politely, and spoke only when invited. They were dressed like miniature adults, perfect posture, perfect smiles. But even there, between lessons and etiquette, small cracks of joy appeared. A governess might sneak them sweets. A servant might tell them a silly rhyme. A brother and sister might giggle behind a closed door, laughing at something utterly forbidden, which of course made it even funnier. So yes, family and faith were serious business in the 18th century. There were rules, consequences, and plenty of thou shalt not, but there was also love, quiet, firm, sometimes awkwardly expressed, but real all the same. And for every punishment there was comfort, a gentle hand on the shoulder, a whispered prayer, a bedtime story that began with once upon a time and ended with the promise that, no matter how hard the world felt, morning would always come again. Because that's what family was, not perfect, not peaceful, but anchoring. It held children steady in a world that often asked too much of them. Faith kept them believing. Love, even the strict kind, kept them going. And when the day's scolding faded and the candle burned low, a child could still curl up and drift to sleep, knowing deep down they were safe, they were loved, they belonged. There's something almost sacred about a family meal, isn't there? Even in the 18th century, long before refrigerators or toasters, before coffee machines and convenience, people understood the magic of food. It wasn't just about eating, it was about surviving and finding small comfort in the middle of a hard world. For a child in those days, the smell of food was more than hunger, it was home. Picture a tiny kitchen in a country cottage. A fire crackles low in the hearth, and above it hangs a black iron pot that's seen more winters than anyone can count. A mother stirs something thick and steaming, maybe porridge, maybe soup. The air smells of smoke and barley, and there's a soft rhythm to it all. A wooden spoon clinks against the pot. A little boy waits by the door, pretending not to be hungry, yet sneaking glances at the table anyway. In homes like this, mealtime wasn't just part of the day, it was the day. For poor families, the menu was simple, so simple you could memorize it after 1 week. Bread, soup, maybe porridge if there was enough grain, and on lucky days, a bit of salted meat or a slice of cheese that hadn't gone too hard yet. Breakfast might be nothing more than a crust of bread dipped in milk, or a bowl of thin gruel, basically watery oats with a touch of salt. Lunch and supper blurred together, a stew of vegetables, maybe a few scraps of meat, all boiled until it tasted mostly of smoke and patience. And yet, it was loved, because it was warm, because it filled you, even if only halfway, because it meant you'd made it through another day. Children learned early that food didn't appear by magic. They helped gather firewood, grind grain, fetch water, pluck chickens, and wash vegetables. There were no grocery stores or takeout orders, only work. And when the bread finally came out of the oven, dark, crusty, and fragrant, it felt like a reward. Some families even said a small prayer before cutting the first slice, thanking God for what little they had. In their eyes, every meal was a blessing, no matter how humble. Of course, things looked quite different for the rich. In the grand halls of manor houses, tables groaned under the weight of pies, roasts, puddings, and platters of fruit. Children of noble families were served by maids and footmen, their silver spoons polished so bright they could see their reflection in them. They learned table manners before they could spell their own names. How to sit up straight, how to eat quietly, how to dab one's lips with a napkin instead of wiping it on your sleeve. A rule every child had to be reminded of at least once. They were taught that good manners showed good breeding though. Between you and me, even the finest young lords probably snuck a finger into the dessert when no one was looking. For working families, food was both love and labor. Every loaf of bread told a story, of fields plowed, grains harvested, flour ground by hand. Every bowl of stew meant someone had spent hours preparing it, even when their hands were tired and their back ached. Mealtime was the one time of day when everyone came together, the father from the fields, the mother from the washhouse, the children from chores or school. They'd gather around the table, say grace, and share what there was. There wasn't always enough for seconds. Sometimes, the smallest child got the best piece, because that's how love spoke in quiet, practical ways. And, oh, the smells. Even now, if you could travel back and step into a kitchen of that time, you'd remember it forever. the earthy scent of turnips and leeks, the sharpness of vinegar used to preserve pickles, the sweetness of apples stored for winter, or honey dripping slowly from a wooden spoon. For children, these smells were the background music of life, constant, comforting, familiar. And in a world with so little sugar, even a piece of dried fruit or a spoonful of jam felt like a festival. In the countryside, the rhythm of meals followed the seasons. Spring brought milk and eggs, new greens and fresh herbs. Summer meant berries, bread and butter, if the cows were generous. Autumn filled the table with root vegetables and warm stews. Winter, well, winter was tough. Families relied on what they'd managed to store: salted meat, dried beans, hard cheese, or jars of pickled vegetables. Children learned early to eat what was given and not complain. If something tasted bitter, you smiled anyway, because bitter was still better than empty. Even the act of eating was different. Forks weren't common everywhere, especially in poor homes. Fingers and spoons did the job just fine. Plates might be shared, bowls passed down the line. The youngest sometimes sat on stools or even the floor, dipping their bread into the same bowl as everyone else. It wasn't fancy, but it was together, and that togetherness, the laughter, the chatter, the warmth of a shared fire made every meal feel richer than it was. Children often remembered the small treats most of all: a bit of honey on bread after a long week, a piece of fruit saved from market day, or a meat pie on a holiday, steaming and golden, smelling like heaven itself. For special occasions, a fair, a feast, or a church day, sweets appeared like miracles: gingerbread men, sugar-dusted biscuits, or sticky puddings. It wasn't just about the taste. It was about joy, that rare, shining kind that made a hard life feel soft for a moment. And at the end of each meal, when the plates were wiped clean and the fire burned low, there was quiet. The kind of quiet that feels full, not empty. A tired father leaning back in his chair, a mother darning by the light of the coals, a child fighting sleep, head resting on the table. No one said much. They didn't need to. The simple act of eating together, of surviving another day, another season, was enough. Today, when we open our fridges and find them full, it's easy to forget how precious a warm meal used to be. For children in the 18th century, food wasn't just sustenance. It was safety. It was family. It was proof that the world, for all its coldness, still cared for them in small, delicious ways. So if you ever find yourself with a warm bowl in your hands and the smell of something good in the air, take a breath. Somewhere, long ago, an 18th century child did the same, and for one brief, beautiful moment, they too felt full and very, very lucky. In the 18th century, a cough could whisper danger. A fever could send shivers of fear through an entire household. Because back then, being sick wasn't just uncomfortable. It could be a matter of life and death. There were no antibiotics, no pharmacies on every corner. If you fell ill, your best doctor was often your mother, your neighbor, or a prayer whispered into the dark. And for children, small, fragile, and full of life, that was the scariest truth of all. Most families kept a small box or jar tucked away, a kind of homemade medicine chest. Inside were the family's secrets: dried herbs, roots, bottles of strange-smelling oils, and sometimes a little faith. Remedies were passed down like heirlooms. Boiled this for fever, rub that on the chest, say this prayer before bed. And while some cures were harmless, others were, let's say, creative. Got a sore throat? Gargle with vinegar and honey. A headache? Press a slice of onion to your temple. A fever? Drink tea made from willow bark. That one actually worked. It was nature's aspirin. But some remedies were almost frightening: bloodletting, leeches, or potions mixed with mercury, which helped no one, except maybe the undertaker. For a sick child, the world shrank. No school, no play, no fields or laughter, just the heavy air of the sick room, a single candle flickering, the smell of herbs and damp cloth, the sound of a mother's soft footsteps, the creak of the floorboards, a whispered prayer. It was a place where time slowed down and everything depended on whether the fever broke before morning. And yet, even in sickness, there was love. A mother cooling a forehead with a damp rag, a father watching from the doorway, hat in hand, unsure how to help but unwilling to leave. Brothers and sisters peeking in with worried faces, offering flowers or bits of bread they thought might make things better. Children back then were tougher than we can imagine they had to be. A scrape or cut could become infected. A winter chill could turn into pneumonia. And when smallpox or measles came through town, Families prayed harder than ever. It wasn't uncommon for illness to take someone young. It's a sad truth, but it makes the survival of every child a small miracle. Every birthday, every healthy morning felt like a victory. In towns and cities, doctors existed, but few could afford them. Their tools looked more like something from a blacksmith's shed. Saws, clamps, knives. Surgery meant pain, because there were no anesthetics, only courage and strong tea. For children of the poor, the doctor was often a wise woman, a healer who knew which plants soothed pain and which ones brought down fever. She might walk in smelling of mint and smoke, with a basket full of herbs and a voice that sounded like the forest itself. To a frightened child, she was half nurse, half witch, half miracle worker, and sometimes she was the only reason a sick room didn't end in silence. Not all fears were about real sickness, though. Children's minds were full of imagination, and sickness carried mystery. They whispered stories of ghosts who brought fevers, or curses that lived in bad air. If someone died, they said the house was haunted for a while, until prayers were said and candles were lit to drive the spirits away. In a world without science as we know it, fear filled the gaps where knowledge hadn't yet reached, and children, with their wide eyes and wild dreams, believed every word. But let's not forget, not every story ended sadly. There were recoveries too. There were mornings when the fever broke, when color returned to a child's cheeks, when the air in the house suddenly felt lighter. The mother smiled again. The father brought in extra wood for the fire, and the little patient, weak but alive, was allowed to sip broth and watch sunlight through the window. That sunlight must have felt like a blessing, soft, golden proof that life had chosen to stay a little longer. In richer homes, there were more comforts, feather beds, warm rooms, servants to bring food. But illness came for everyone, rich or poor. Even a prince's fever could send the whole palace into prayer. Sickness didn't care about titles, it knocked on every door. That's one of the few things that made all children equal back then. When your body ached and your breath was short, it didn't matter if your father was a farmer or a lord. What mattered was hope and the quiet strength of the people caring for you. When night fell in a sick room, the world outside disappeared. Only the fire and the faint light of a candle kept the dark away. Some parents sat awake all night, listening to the shallow breaths of their child, whispering prayers with each one. And sometimes, in those hours between midnight and dawn, they'd hum a tune, not quite a lullaby, but something close. Something to say, "You're still here, we're still here. Keep breathing." It's strange to think about, but in that time of hardship, illness brought families closer. When someone got sick, the house became gentler. People spoke softer. They worked together. Even the busiest fathers came home early. It was as if sickness reminded everyone how fragile life really was and how much they needed each other. Today, we have medicine, hospitals, and vaccines. But those small moments, a parent watching over a sleeping child, a hand resting on a fevered brow, a prayer whispered into the dark, those haven't changed at all. They're timeless. Because no matter the century, no matter the science, love is still the best medicine we have. So the next time you wake up feeling a little under the weather, remember them, those 18th century children, lying under wool blankets, listening to the wind outside and hoping for morning. Remember the mothers who never left their side, and remember the quiet bravery it took just to heal, one slow breath at a time. If you want to understand a time, just look at its clothes. They tell you everything: who was rich, who was poor, who worked, and who dreamed of something better. And for children in the 18th century, clothes told their stories long before they could read or write. Every button, every patch, every bit of frayed lace was a little piece of history, stitched with love, duty, or just plain survival. Let's start with the simplest of homes, where the chickens wandered freely, and smoke curled up through the chimney instead of out of a fancy fireplace. A poor child's wardrobe was easy to describe. There wasn't much of it. Maybe 2 shirts if you were lucky, one for wearing and one for washing, and washing meant a cold stream, rough hands, and a lot of scrubbing. Clothes were made to last, or at least to keep trying. Most children wore hand-me-downs, not just from siblings, but sometimes from neighbors, cousins, or anyone who'd outgrown something still in one piece. A patched sleeve wasn't shameful. It was a sign that your family made do, that your mother's hands could turn rags into comfort. And if your trousers were too short, well, you'd simply grow out of them a little more and roll them down in embarrassment, though secretly proud that you were growing at all. For everyday wear, Poor boys wore simple linen shirts, coarse wool trousers, and maybe a waistcoat if the family could afford one. Girls wore long shifts like plain dresses, often with an apron tied in front. Aprons were everything: napkin, towel, pocket, and sometimes even a handkerchief for wiping tears or snot. Shoes were a treasure. Some children went barefoot most of the year, their feet tough as leather from running through mud, grass, and stone. When winter came, the lucky ones had wooden clogs or shoes stuffed with straw for warmth. You could hear them clopping down the road long before you saw their faces, like a little parade of determination. Now, if you wandered into a grand estate or a city townhouse, the story changed completely. Their children looked like miniature adults, their clothes stiff, polished, and, quite honestly, a little uncomfortable. Young boys from wealthy families wore tiny breeches, white stockings, silk waistcoats, and coats with buttons so shiny they looked like coins. Their collars were starched so high they couldn't turn their heads without turning their whole body. Girls wore petticoats, corsets, yes, even little ones, and gowns tied neatly at the waist with ribbons. Their hair was brushed, powdered, and sometimes decorated with flowers or bows so big they could practically fly away. It looked beautiful, but it didn't feel very fun when you wanted to run or climb a tree. One wrong move, and a governess was there, gasping, "Careful, Miss, that lace cost more than your father's patience." For working children, those in service, on farms, or in apprenticeships, clothing was about practicality. You needed to move, to carry, to work without worrying about ruining something fancy. Aprons, caps, and strong fabrics ruled the day. You wore your work on your sleeves, literally. The smell of hay, flour, soot, or soap stuck to everything. And at night, when you finally took your clothes off, you could see the shape of your day left behind, the dust of effort, the mark of life. Children learned early how much effort went into making clothes. There were no factories yet to do the work. Every thread came from a hand that spun it, every stitch from fingers that often bled from sewing by candlelight. Mothers and daughters worked together, gossiping and humming softly as they mended. The rhythm of the needle going in and out of cloth was as familiar as breathing. Clothes connected generations, a baby's bonnet sewn from a grandmother's old gown, or a jacket lined with scraps from a wedding dress. Nothing was wasted. Even rags found new life as doll clothes, bandages, or quilts stitched from memories. And oh, the feeling of growing up in that world. Children measured time not by birthdays, but by how their clothes changed. When a boy traded his long gown for breeches, that was a big moment. It meant he was no longer a baby. He stood a little taller, tried to act braver, even if his knees still knocked. For girls, growing up often meant their dresses became longer, their sleeves tighter, their movements gentler. They learned to sit properly, to walk without tripping on hems, to carry themselves like a lady, as their mothers said. Sometimes, you could see the conflict in their eyes, half proud, half wishing they could still run barefoot through the grass. Clothes were more than fabric. They were identity. A poor child could feel the weight of class in every frayed cuff. A rich child could feel the weight of expectation in every corset string. And yet, there were moments when clothes didn't matter at all. When a muddy game broke out in the street. When brothers and sisters laughed until they fell over, ignoring dirt and stitches alike. In those moments, every child was just that, a child. Seasons changed the wardrobe. Winter brought thick wool, scarves, and cloaks that smelled faintly of smoke and rain. Spring meant lighter fabrics, bright ribbons, and maybe, if your family had the means, a new bonnet or hat. And then there were Sundays, the day everyone looked their best. Even the poorest families had Sunday clothes, carefully folded and kept safe for church. Children knew better than to spill anything on them, though the anxiety probably made them more likely to do just that. Still, those Sunday mornings, when everyone stepped out in their cleanest, proudest clothes, there was a shared dignity in it, a quiet belief that, for one day at least, everyone could look their finest. Shoes, though shoes told their own stories. They were made to last, but never quite did. They pinched, they wore thin, they squeaked on cold mornings. And when they finally gave out, there was always someone with stronger hands and a bit of leather to patch them up again. Some children remembered the sound of their parents mending shoes late into the night, the rhythmic tap of a hammer, the sigh of tired satisfaction. It wasn't much, but it was love you could hear. In the end, 18th century children didn't have wardrobes full of choices. They had what they needed, and often less than that. but what they wore was part of who they were, their family, their struggle, their small triumphs. Every patch said, "We care." Every stitch said, "We tried." And every soft threadbare sleeve said, "You're growing up, little one. You're doing just fine." Every child belongs somewhere, a corner of the world where the sounds, smells, and sights wrap around them like a lullaby. In the 18th century, that place might have been a noisy, bustling town filled with clattering carts and the shouts of market traders, or it might have been a quiet village, where the wind hummed through hedgerows and the fields stretched endlessly under pale skies. Two very different worlds, yet children in both laughed, played, and wandered in their own ways. Let's start in the country, where most children lived. It was a world painted in soft greens and browns, mud underfoot, hay in your hair, and the scent of damp earth after rain. Children woke early, often before the sun, to the crow of roosters and the steady lowing of cows. There were chores to do before breakfast: fetching water, feeding chickens, sweeping hearths, or gathering firewood. The air was cool and sweet, sometimes heavy with mist that made the fields look like they were sleeping too. If you listened closely, you could hear the faint chatter of birds, the distant clack of a mill wheel, and the creak of cartwheels on dirt roads. That was the countryside's music.com, rhythmic and timeless. When chores were done, there was freedom, the kind of wild, barefoot freedom that no city could offer. Children played in meadows and streams, building little boats out of bark, pretending to be explorers or kings. They climbed trees, chased rabbits, and sometimes just lay on the grass, staring up at the sky, tracing the shape of clouds. They learned the names of things not from books, but from living with them. The feel of nettles, ouch, the sound of bees, the way a frog leaps, the smell of wild thyme when you crush it between your fingers. Life in the country was hard, yes, but it was honest. Children were close to the earth, and the earth became their playground, their teacher, and sometimes their comfort. And then there was the town, noisy, crowded, full of movement and mystery. Imagine cobblestone streets, slick with morning rain. Carts rumbled by, pulled by horses whose hooves clattered like thunder. Vendors called out from wooden stalls, apples, fresh bread, ribbons for your hair, and everywhere there were people weaving, shouting, hurrying, living. For a child, it could feel like the whole world was awake at once. Town children learned to dart between adults' legs, to dodge puddles and carriages, to carry messages or sell small things, flowers, matches, pins, or papers. They grew up fast, their games mixed with errands, their laughter often chased away by the need to work. But even in that busy world, they found wonder: the glow of shop windows at dusk, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the excitement of seeing a traveling show set up in the square with bright costumes, drums, and magic tricks that made them gasp. If you walked from country to town, you could feel the change as clearly as a shift in the wind. The air grew thicker with smoke, the sound sharper and faster. Instead of the soft rustle of leaves, there were church bells, wheels, and distant laughter. Children from the countryside might visit the market town once a week to sell eggs, butter, or handmade goods. For them, it was an adventure. The colors, the noise, the strange smells, all overwhelming, but thrilling. Some would stand at the edge of the street, wide-eyed, watching the world move in a way their quiet villages never did. And when they went home, they'd tell stories about the wonders they'd seen: the man with a trained monkey, the woman selling candied apples, the boy who danced on stilts. Town children, on the other hand, sometimes longed for the country. They heard stories about green fields and starlit skies. They imagined a place where the air didn't smell of soot, where rivers ran clean, and where silence wasn't scary but peaceful. And sometimes during the summer, a city child might visit a relative in the countryside and discover what it meant to breathe deeply, to run freely, to sleep under the whisper of trees instead of the creak of roofs. That first night away from the city, the silence must have seemed enormous, but slowly they would hear the softer sounds: crickets, owls, and their own heartbeat blending into the dark. There was one place, though, where town and country met: the market. Every week, wagons rolled in from nearby villages, filled with produce, fabrics, and goods to sell. Children came along, helping their parents set up stalls or simply watching the chaos unfold. Markets were full of wonder, like living theaters. You could smell fresh bread and manure all at once. You could hear fiddlers, dogs barking, laughter, and the occasional shout of "stop." Thief, when someone tried to make off with an apple. A child might earn a penny running errands, or lose it just as quickly on sweets or marbles. It was noisy, messy, and full of life. But oh, what a memory it made. In both the town and the country, one thing stayed the same. Children learned to notice the small things. The creak of a floorboard at dawn, the taste of fresh milk or roasted chestnuts, the comfort of the same paths walked day after day, until the world felt both big and small all at once. They might not have traveled far, but their imaginations carried them everywhere. When night fell, towns glowed with candlelight spilling from windows, the air heavy with smoke and song. In the country, stars blanketed the sky, so many you could lose count before you even began. Somewhere, a child lay down, listening to the world outside, the city hum or the country hush, and drifted slowly to sleep, dreaming of what tomorrow might bring. Night came differently in the 18th century. There were no glowing screens, no streetlights painting the walls gold, only the slow fall of darkness, deep, patient, and full of secrets. Children would watch as mothers or servants lit candles one by one, tiny suns flickering to life in the corners of rooms. The smell of wax filled the air. Shadows danced on walls, and the world began to whisper. It was bedtime. And for children of that century, bedtime was when the real stories began. Long before books were common, stories lived in voices. Grandmothers with soft wrinkles and sharp memories told tales that had been passed down for generations. Tales of fairies, ghosts, and things that rustled in the dark. A child would curl up beneath rough linen sheets, eyes wide, as the storyteller's voice wove pictures in the air. They didn't need fancy illustrations. Their minds did the painting. Sometimes the stories were gentle, of kind spirits and brave heroes who found lost treasures. Sometimes they were deliciously scary about witches in the forest, or headless horsemen who rode through the night mist. The storyteller's voice might drop to a whisper, and just when the traveler thought he was safe, the candle would flicker, and every creak in the house suddenly sounded alive. Children would pull the blanket to their noses, half afraid, half delighted. These tales weren't just for fun, they were lessons in disguise. Stories taught children to be clever, to be kind, to beware of strangers, and to believe that good could overcome evil. They also helped make sense of a world that was often confusing and harsh. A story could explain why storms came, the sky giants are quarreling, why illness struck, a bad wind carried it, or why kindness mattered, the fairy rewards those with gentle hearts. And when the story ended, there would often be a pause, a small silence filled with the sound of the fire settling, the house breathing, the night pressing softly against the windows. Then, the storyteller might murmur, "Sleep well, little one. The fairies are listening," and the child, feeling safe and seen, would drift off into dreams shaped by the tale. Dreams themselves were a mystery in those days. People believed they meant something, messages, omens, or echoes from the spirit world. Children would tell each other in the morning, "I dreamed I was flying. Maybe it means I'll grow tall," or "I saw a white horse. That's good luck." Dreams were part of the same magic as daylight games, the mind's secret playground. They turned the day's chores and stories into wild adventures where anything was possible. But the night also had its fears. Remember, the world was darker then, literally. No lamps in the street, no hum of electricity, only the wind moaning through chimneys, dogs barking far away, and the occasional knock of a shutter in the breeze. Children feared ghosts, thieves, wild animals, and sometimes even the dark itself. A half-open door could look like a monster's mouth. A loose branch tapping the window could sound like fingers. Parents would comfort them with charms and prayers. A Bible under the pillow, a cross on the wall, a whispered blessing before bed. Simple things, but powerful enough to chase away bad dreams. And slowly, fear would fade into the steady rhythm of sleep. In wealthier homes, bedtime looked a little different. There might be a nursemaid telling stories from a small stool beside a canopy bed, a clock ticking softly on the mantel, the faint scent of lavender sprinkled on linen. The stories there might come from books, collections of fables and moral tales written to teach proper behavior. But even those, once the candlelight hit just right, could feel magical. A talking fox, a clever princess, a brave soldier, familiar friends returning night after night. And when the last word was spoken, the maid would close the book with a soft thump, tuck in the blankets, and whisper, "Good night, my little master. Dream kindly." For children in cottages, bedtime was simpler but no less precious. Several might share the same bed, brothers, sisters, cousins, squeezed together for warmth. The mattress stuffed with straw, the blanket patched and heavy, the air cold enough to see your breath. But in that closeness, there was comfort, the sound of someone else breathing beside you, the small giggles before sleep, the whispered, "Tell me one more story." And maybe someone would, because in those days, stories were how people loved each other. When sleep finally came, it was deep and quiet. Dreams might wander through meadows, over rooftops, or into worlds where toys came alive and lost children found their way home. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, and the stars, brighter than any lamp, kept watch. And if you could somehow step back in time and peek into one of those tiny, flickering rooms, you'd see the same thing you see today, a child asleep, face soft with wonder, dreaming of things that feel real and impossible all at once. Because though centuries pass, the language of dreams never changes. Every child, in every age, drifts into that same gentle mystery, the place where stories live on, glowing quietly behind closed eyes. Growing up in the 18th century wasn't something that happened slowly. One day, you were a child chasing marbles or playing with a hoop, and the next, someone handed you a broom, a needle, or a hammer, and said, "It's time." There wasn't really a middle stage called teenager back then. There was only child, and then worker. And for most children, that change came sooner than they expected. By the time a boy or girl reached 12 or 13, life began to shift. Their hands, once busy with toys, now learned tools. Their voices grew steadier, their days longer, and though they still laughed, it was quieter, as if the world around them had gently reminded them, it is time to grow up. For the sons of farmers, that meant rising before dawn to tend animals, sow fields, or help bring in harvests. Their fathers might clap them on the shoulder and say, "You're strong enough now." A short sentence, but a heavy one, because strength meant responsibility. It meant becoming part of the great machine of survival. For many girls, the path was set just as clearly. They learned to cook, to mend, to clean, to care for younger siblings. Mothers taught them the rhythm of home, the endless list of small tasks that kept a family alive and dignified. Some became apprentices to seamstresses or maidservants in larger homes. They scrubbed floors, polished silver, carried trays, and learned the quiet grace of service. Each chore was a kind of training, a test of patience, humility, and endurance. Yet even in those lessons, there was pride, a well-sewn hem, a loaf baked perfectly brown, a compliment from a mistress. Small things, but they gave a sense of worth, the feeling that one's hands could create something good. Of course, the path looked very different for children born into wealth. Young lords and ladies didn't go to work, at least, not the kind with dirt or capuses. Their duty was to learn refinement, dancing, languages, etiquette, and the proper way to stand, speak, and smile. A boy might be sent away to school or university to study law or theology. A girl might learn music, embroidery, and conversation, all in preparation for the great expectation, marriage. Their days were filled with lessons, tutors, and polite conversation at dinner. Yet even in fine houses, children sometimes gazed out the window, wishing they could climb a tree instead of curtsying to a stranger. For working children, apprenticeships were a common doorway to adulthood. A boy might be bound to a blacksmith, a printer, or a carpenter, sometimes for 7 long years. In return for food, shelter, and training, he gave his labor and obedience. Many left home before they turned 10, carrying little more than a small bag of clothes and their parents' blessing. It was hard, lonely, even, but apprenticeships offered a future. If you worked hard, someday you might have your own shop, your own trade, your own small freedom. And that dream, simple as it was, kept many children going. Growing older also meant growing aware of how the world worked and where you stood in it. A child might begin to notice the differences between rich and poor, between master and servant, between freedom and duty. They might start asking quiet questions. Why do we have so little? Why must I serve while others play? But the answers rarely came easily or kindly. In most families, survival left little room for rebellion. So children learned to adapt, to bow, to smile, to keep working. And inside, they kept their small dreams alive, like hidden sparks. Still, even in those heavy years of early responsibility, there were moments of light. A stolen hour by the river after chores, a fair in the nearby town, a letter from home that smelled faintly of bread and smoke, or simply the satisfaction of finishing a long day and hearing someone say, "Well done," because deep down, every child, no matter how old they became, wanted that, to be seen, to be valued, to be told that what they did mattered. And then, one day, you might not be called child anymore. Maybe someone said, "He's a fine young man now," or "She's ready for her own household." It was a compliment, but it also meant the end of something quiet and precious. That was how childhood faded in the 18th century. Not with a ceremony, not with a party, but with a slow, unnoticed transformation. The same hands that once held a toy now held tools. The same voice that once sang nursery songs now spoke with measured calm. And before anyone realized it, the child was gone and an adult stood in their place. Still, that inner child never vanished completely. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, when work was done and the fire burned low, they would remember the games by the river, the stories by candlelight, the laughter that echoed through summer fields. They would smile, just for a moment, and feel that spark of youth still flickering inside. Because no matter how many years pass, the child within never truly disappears. It simply learns to hide behind steady eyes and busy hands, waiting for the rare moment when the world slows down enough to listen again. And so, in the 18th century, growing older meant stepping into duty, into expectation, into the rhythm of adult life, but it also meant carrying the memory of simpler days, tucked quietly inside the heart. When you think of those children now grown, imagine them not as tired workers or distant figures in portraits. Imagine them as they truly were, once barefoot in the fields, once giggling in the dark, once dreaming of something bigger, because every adult, in every century, was once a child, looking at the world through small eyes and wondering what came next. Close your eyes for a moment. Try to picture them, the children of the 18th century. A girl with tangled hair and bare feet, running down a muddy lane with a laugh that echoes like bells. A boy with soot on his face, balancing a bucket too big for his hands. A group of them sitting by the fire, whispering secrets, sharing crusts of bread, and watching the shadows dance on the wall. They lived so long ago, and yet, somehow, they still feel close, don't they? It's strange to think that their world was once as real as ours. The cobblestones they walked on are probably buried now, covered by layers of earth and time. The houses they lived in, some are dust, some are museums, some are gone without a trace. But their laughter once filled the air. Their small feet once ran through the same wind that still moves across the world today. Every field, every street, every quiet corner once held the sound of children's voices. If you could listen closely enough, maybe you'd still hear them faintly, carried by the breeze that travels between centuries. Some of them lived easy lives, filled with lessons, toys, and fine meals. Others worked harder than we can imagine, scrubbing, sewing, sweeping, until their little hands ached. Some made it to adulthood, strong and proud. Others didn't, but all of them lived. They dreamed, they played, they loved the same way children always have, simply, fiercely, without question. Their joys and fears weren't so different from ours. A scraped knee, a stern parent, a new friend, a bedtime story that made them shiver, then smile. Time has changed our tools and our toys, but not the beating of a young heart. When we talk about history, we often picture kings and battles, great inventions and big ideas. But the real story of humanity, the soft, beating heart of it, has always been told through the eyes of children. They are the thread that ties every century together. Each generation grows up, teaches the next, and watches them begin again, a repeating rhythm, like a lullaby whispered through time. Somewhere in that chain, the children of the 18th century held hands with the children of the 19th, who grew into the parents of the 20th, and so on, until, eventually, they led to us, to you. Think of what's different now. Warm beds, books filled with color, toys that light up, the hum of electricity instead of the crackle of fire, and yet the feeling of childhood, it's still the same. That spark of curiosity, that wish to understand the world, that small, soft wonder before sleep, those things never left us. They just changed shape. Maybe that's why stories like this matter, not because they tell us what happened, but because they remind us how it felt to live, to hope, to grow. The children of the past remind us to be gentle with ourselves, with others, with time. They remind us that every person you pass on the street was once small, scared, and full of dreams. They remind us that history isn't just old books and forgotten names. It's a collection of heartbeats, millions of them, that once beat just like yours. If you could walk through a village from 250 years ago, I think you'd recognize more than you'd expect. You'd see a girl skipping rope, her laughter ringing out. You'd see a boy trying to balance a stick on his nose, his friends cheering him on. You'd see a tired mother smiling as her children fall asleep beside the fire. You'd smell bread, hear songs, and feel the same warmth that families still share today. Different clothes, different words, but the same love, the same rhythm of living. And now, here we are, you, listening in the quiet, centuries later. The candles are gone, but maybe your screen glows softly like one. Outside, the wind still moves, just as it did back then. And maybe, if you close your eyes, you can almost see them, those long ago children, running, laughing, fading slowly into the dusk. Not ghosts, just memories, made gentle by time. They've left behind the world we live in now, a world shaped by their small footsteps, their songs, their stories, and somehow, in remembering them, we keep them alive. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let the centuries fall away. Let the noise of modern life fade. Imagine the sound of crackling firewood, the murmur of old voices, the rustle of straw beds. Breathe slowly. Feel the calm of their world, slower, simpler, softer, and know that somewhere, deep down, the child within you still walks those same cobblestone streets, still looks at the stars with quiet awe, and still believes in stories, because the past isn't gone. It just sleeps, like a child at rest, waiting for someone kind enough to remember. Soft wind drifts through old trees. The faint echo of a lullaby rises and fades. Good night, little ones, wherever you are. When we talk about the 18th century, we often picture powdered wigs, candlelit parlors, and grand speeches about empires and revolutions. But underneath all that noise, behind the portraits and politics, there were small voices too. The giggles, cries, and songs of children, weaving quietly through the same world of kings and cobblers. Their lives might seem distant now, tucked away in faded letters or dusty village records, but their lessons still echo softly through time, if we know how to listen. Lesson 1. Joy is simple for all the hardship and hunger. Children in the 18th century still found joy, and they found it in the smallest places. In a wooden hoop rolling down a dirt road, in a marble glinting in the sun, in a stick that could become a sword, a horse, or a wand, with just a bit of imagination. They didn't wait for permission to be happy, they simply were. Joy wasn't something they bought, it was something they noticed. Think of it, a child sitting by the hearth, humming to themselves while carving a doll out of scrap wood. Their hands rough, their stomach not quite full, yet their eyes shining with quiet pride. Maybe that's the first lesson they left us, that happiness doesn't need grandeur, it just needs space, and a moment to breathe. Lesson 2. Strength can be gentle. We often think of strength as loud, the kind that wins battles or builds empires, but the strength of those children was quieter, humbler, and maybe braver in its own way. They woke before sunrise, worked until their hands were raw, and still found time to laugh. They faced sickness, hunger, and loss, not with speeches, but with patience. They didn't have the luxury of choice, yet they carried on with a kind of grace that hums softly through the centuries. There is a story from old records about a boy who lost both parents to fever and was taken in by a blacksmith. He worked, learned the trade, and by 20 had a forge of his own. No grand fame, no fortune, but his story is written in the soot and sweat that shaped his life, a quiet triumph. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones who never got to tell their story out loud. Lesson 3. Curiosity is sacred. Children then didn't have classrooms full of maps or shelves full of books. Knowledge came from watching, from doing, from asking, what's that bird called? Why does the wind sound different in winter? How does fire know how to dance? Curiosity was their teacher. They learned the language of rivers, the moods of seasons, the secrets of the soil. A child might not read Latin, but they could predict rain by the smell of the air. They could tell the time by shadows or the nearness of cows coming home. We've traded some of that curiosity for convenience. We no longer need to guess the weather, our phones tell us. We don't stare at the stars to find our way, satellites do it for us. But those 18th century children remind us that wonder isn't something you outgrow, it's a way of seeing. And when you lose it, the world becomes smaller, even with all its modern magic. Lesson 4. Community is survival. Back then, families were everything. Not just blood, but neighbors, tradesmen, the baker, the midwife. Everyone played a part in the fragile web of daily life. Children grew up surrounded by people who needed each other. If a chimney sweep fell ill, another family might take his children in for the week. If a farmer's crop failed, the village shared what little they had. Life was hard, but it was shared, and that made it bearable. A child might be poor, but they weren't alone. There was always a hand to hold, a story to share, a loaf to split in half. In our time, with all our noise and connections, loneliness has somehow grown louder. Maybe those old children, with their patched clothes and open hearts, knew something we've forgotten. That we don't survive because we have much, but because we have each other. Lesson 5. Imagination is freedom for many of those children. Life was a cage built from duty and poverty, but inside their minds, they were free. They imagined castles in the clouds. They gave voices to dolls, stories to shadows, and courage to their fears. Imagination didn't just entertain them, it protected them. When the world outside felt heavy, their dreams built worlds of their own. And sometimes, those dreams turned into real futures, inventions, art, ideas that carried humanity forward. We like to think imagination belongs to artists or geniuses, but no, it belongs to every child who ever stared out a window and wondered, what if? That's how every age begins again. With one small voice asking a question the adults stopped asking. Lesson 6. Time is a gift. Children in the 18th century lived closer to nature's rhythm, slower, softer, steadier. They rose with the sun and rested when darkness fell. There was time to notice things. The shape of clouds, the hum of bees, the smell of rain on stone. They didn't measure life by minutes or notifications. They measured it by moments, by the seasons, by meals, by stories told beside the fire. Time felt heavier then, but also more precious, because they didn't have much of it. They paid attention. Maybe that's what they'd tell us now. Don't rush so much. You're living the thing you keep trying to reach. Time isn't a race, it's a companion, walking beside us quietly. And the children of the past knew how to walk with it. Lesson 7. Every life is history. We often remember the grand names, kings, queens, inventors, explorers. But history was never just theirs. It also belonged to the baker's son who whistled on his way to work, to the weaver's daughter who sang while threading her loom, to the small, nameless hands that built, cleaned, carried, and cared. Every child who ever lived added a note to humanity's song. Most of them went unheard, but the melody wouldn't exist without them. When you think of the 18th century now, don't picture only portraits and palaces. Picture faces you'll never know, little smiles, bare feet, the whisper of lullabies that no one wrote down. Those are history too, the invisible kind, and they deserve remembering. So what do we do with these lessons? Maybe we slow down a little, maybe we smile more easily, maybe we look at a child, any child, and remember that they re part of a much older story, one that stretches back through every generation of laughter and tears. Maybe, before sleep, we whisper thanks for the children who came before us, for the ones growing now, and for the child still living quietly inside each of us. Because even though the world has changed, even though our nights glow brighter and our days move faster, the same small hearts still beat beneath it all. And if you listen carefully, under the hum of the present, you might still hear the soft echo of the 18th century, the rustle of straw beds, the laughter in a meadow, the song of a lullaby fading into the night. So rest now. Let the past breathe with you for a while. The world keeps turning, but time, in its kindness, always leaves a little space for memory. And somewhere, in that space, the children of long ago are still playing, still learning, still watching the stars, still whispering their secrets into the wind. And the wind still carries them softly, endlessly, right to where you are. If the children of the 18th century could speak to us now, I think their voices would be small at first, hesitant, curious, like the rustle of leaves before a breeze. They wouldn't speak in grand speeches or heavy history. They'd speak in whispers, in the language of soft memories. And if we listened carefully, this is what they might say. We were here. You might not see us in your books or on your walls, but we were here. We ran through muddy fields with bare feet and wild laughter. We chased chickens and dreams in the same breath. We woke to the creak of floorboards and the smell of fire smoke. We watched our parents' faces as they worried, worked, and prayed. Some of us lived in fine houses with silver spoons and velvet curtains. Some of us slept in barns, wrapped in rags, sharing warmth with the animals. But we all dreamed, every one of us. We dreamed of growing up strong, of tasting fresh bread from the oven, of seeing the sea, or hearing music from the next village over. We were the small hearts of a big, uncertain world. We mattered, even if no one remembered our names. We worked because we had to. Don't feel sorry for us, not too much. We worked because we had to, because that was life. The fields needed hands, the chimneys needed cleaning, the looms needed turning. We didn't have time to ask why. We just learned to do it well. We carried buckets that were too heavy and wore shoes that were too small or none at all. Sometimes we sang while we worked. Sometimes we cried. But even in the hardest days, there was pride. When the master nodded in approval, when a loaf of bread came out just right, when our younger siblings smiled at us with sleepy eyes at night. We didn't know we were being strong. We just were. Because strength was the only way forward. We found joy anyway. You might think our world was grey, but it wasn't. We saw colour in candlelight, in ribbons on market days, in the first wildflowers of spring. We made our own toys, sticks, cloth, stones, imagination. We played games that didn't need rules, because laughter was the only rule that mattered. We danced when music came to town, and even when it didn't, we made our own. A tin whistle, a drum from an old pot, a song passed down through generations. Even in hunger, we shared crumbs. Even in winter, we shared stories. Even in silence, we shared hope. Joy was never far away, because joy lived in us, not around us. We were afraid sometimes. We'll be honest, we were scared too. Of fevers that came without warning. Of storms that rattled the roof and shook the walls. Of grown-ups' anger, or the sound of boots in the street. The world was big, and we were small. But fear taught us something important, how to hold on to each other. When one of us was sick, the others whispered prayers. When a friend was punished, we stayed close, waiting, sharing pieces of bread under our coats. Fear was real, but so was kindness. And sometimes, they lived side by side to guests in the same small heart. We loved deeply, even quietly. We didn't say I love you as much as people do now. It wasn't the way of things, but we showed it. In sharing food, in walking miles together to fetch water, in mending someone's torn sleeve without being asked. Love was simple. A fire kept burning in a cold room. It wasn't spoken loudly, but it lasted longer than words. We loved our mothers who sang to us while sewing by candlelight. We loved our fathers, even when their hands were rough and tired. We loved our brothers and sisters, even when they teased us endlessly. Love was never something we learned. It was something we carried from birth, like a small light that never went out. We dreamed of you. You might not believe this, but sometimes we dreamed of the future. We imagined what the world would become. Would there still be wars? Would children still work like we did? Would the stars look the same? Some nights, lying awake on straw beds, we wished for a gentler world, one where children could laugh without fear of hunger, where learning was a right, not a privilege. And now, when we look at your world, your bright lights, your full shelves, your voices carried across oceans, we smile a little. You made it here. You became the future we hoped for. And yes, there are still troubles, still sadness, still noise, but there is also kindness, there is freedom, there is choice. You are what we dreamed of, the proof that all our small lives mattered. Please remember, that's what they'd ask, more than anything, to be remembered. Not with monuments or museums, but with quiet thought, a whisper of thanks before sleep. Remember the children who ran through the fields, who carried buckets and books, who laughed, cried, dreamed, and worked in the glow of the 18th century. Remember the children who never grew up, the ones whose names faded before they could be written down, the ones whose toys were lost to time, but whose laughter still lingers in the air, like dust dancing in a beam of sunlight. They're not gone, not really. Every child who ever lived still echoes through the world somehow, in your own laughter, in the way you hum when you're tired, in the way a story feels like home. And if those children could whisper one last thing, as you drift towards sleep, it would be this: live kindly, dream often, love with your hands, not just your heart, and never forget the smallness that makes you human, because they knew, as only children can, that life is fragile, but beautiful. That time moves fast, but tenderness slows it down. That no matter how big the world becomes, every soul begins the same way, as a child, looking up at the stars, wondering what it all means. So tonight, as your eyes grow heavy, imagine them sitting beside you, a little boy with straw in his hair, a little girl holding a worn-out doll. They're smiling, not sadly, but softly, because after all this time, someone is still listening, someone still cares, and that's all they ever wanted. If there is a place where time forgets to move, a place where centuries fold softly into each other, it must be the eternal playground. No walls, no clocks, no seasons, just an endless field of sunlight and wind, where children from every age come to play. Here, barefoot 18th century boys chase paper kites stitched by modern hands. A girl from long ago shares her wooden doll with one made of plastic and neon thread. Laughter sounds the same, it always does, high and bright and free. There are no kings or peasants here, no chores, no hunger, no lessons waiting to be learned. Only play, only joy, only the kind of peace that even time itself can't disturb. The children of the past arrive, they come quietly, one by one, out of candlelit cottages and cobblestone streets, out of fields of wheat and narrow alleys. Their faces are curious, their clothes old and simple. Linen shirts, patched trousers, ribbons faded by the sun. But their eyes, oh their eyes, they shine like morning dew. The first thing they notice isn't the sky or the grass, it's the sound. 1,000 different laughs, echoing together, a music made from innocence itself. One child, still carrying a small broom from his chimney-sweeping days, looks at it for a moment, then tosses it aside. He doesn't need it here. Instead, he joins a circle of children playing tag. A little girl who once sewed by candlelight in a cold room runs her fingers through the warm, endless sunlight. She closes her eyes, just to feel it. No more smoke, no more hunger, only warmth, soft and golden. The children of the present arrive, and then come the modern ones. Shoes that light up, laughter that bursts without fear. They carry tablets and snacks and wild imaginations. But as they step into this place, they forget the noise of screens and notifications. They kneel to listen to the older children, who tell stories of kings and plagues and candles. In return, they show the others their music, their toys that glow, their photographs of stars. And somehow, beautifully, it all feels the same. A stick still becomes a sword. A circle still becomes a stage. A handful of grass still becomes treasure. Different centuries, same souls. The playground of forever. The eternal playground stretches as far as dreaming eyes can see. There's a river that sparkles with laughter instead of water. There are trees that grow tiny bells instead of leaves, ringing softly when the wind passes through. There's a swing that reaches the clouds, and when you swing high enough, you can almost touch the moon. There's a small wooden bridge where time doesn't cross. Children step over it and forget when they were born. They just are, alive in a way that needs no year, no history, no sorrow. And in the middle of it all stands a tree, the tree of memory. Its bark hums like a lullaby. Its roots stretch into every century, and when a child leans against it, they can hear their own story whispered back to them, every laugh, every tear, every heartbeat they ever had. It's all still there. Nothing was ever lost. The keepers of the playground sometimes, when night falls on the living world, you can almost hear the whispers of this place. They say that every time someone tells a story about the past, a few children appear beneath the tree of memory. They listen, they smile, they run again for a while, just a little longer. You can't see them, not really, but maybe you felt them, that soft sense of warmth when you tell an old story, that strange comfort that feels like company when you're alone. That's them, the keepers of the playground. They live in our memories, and in every gentle story told before sleep. When night comes to the playground, even this place, eternal as it is, has its night. A soft dusk that rolls in like a sigh. The laughter grows quieter. The children begin to gather around small lanterns that float in the air like stars within reach. Some hum lullabies they learned long ago. Some yawn, eyes heavy with contentment. Others simply lie down in the grass, hands folded beneath their heads, watching the first stars bloom in the sky. No one tells them to go to bed. No one scolds or rushes them. They sleep when they're ready, peaceful, safe, unhurried. And as they drift off, the air fills with a soft sound, like the turning of pages in a storybook. the story that never ends. Every night, a new child arrives. Sometimes from centuries ago, sometimes from just a few moments ago, but all of them find their way here eventually. And each one adds a little piece to the song. A laugh, a dream, a memory. The playground keeps them all. It doesn't matter if they were born into riches or rags, if they worked or studied, if they lived long or only a short while. Here, they are eternal, forever playing, forever resting, forever children. The quiet promise. If you listen closely tonight, maybe you'll hear it too. The soft rhythm beneath the quiet of your room. It's not the ticking of a clock. It's the heartbeat of all those children, echoing through the centuries, reminding you that life, at its heart, has always been about small things. Laughter, kindness, wonder, love. Their promise still lingers, that every story told in kindness keeps the world gentle for just a little longer. And as you breathe, slow and easy, they whisper one last time, sleep now. You've listened well. The past is safe in your heart. And we are still here, playing, laughing, dreaming, where time forgets to hurry. And then, the field grows quiet. The lights fade. The stars settle into place. Somewhere, a bell rings, once soft and low. A signal that the story is complete. And in that stillness, you might almost see them, a blur of children running in moonlight, free and forever young. Their laughter rising like wind through leaves. The 18th century, the 21st, and every age in between, all folded together into one gentle dream. The eternal playground, where the story never really ends.